Welcome to Biden Brief. The content of the briefing includes: Israel agrees to humanitarian pauses, but gulf with U.S. remains. Trump says on Univision he could weaponize FBI, DOJ against his enemies. China envoy to U.S. says stable ties, still a long way off. Biden courts union votes in trip to Midwest car plant. India to seek reassurance on U.S. Indo-Pacific focus amid growing China ties. Israel agrees to humanitarian pauses, but gulf with U.S. remains. Washington Post. Israel has agreed to temporary pauses in its offensive against Hamas in order to allow the distribution of humanitarian aid and the evacuation of civilians. A senior Israeli official confirmed that the tactical, localized pauses will last for 4 hours each day, with 3 hours notice, and will be declared for 4 hours each day in a different area or neighborhood to get medical supplies and food to those in need. The agreement came as CIA Director William J. Burns met in Doha with his Israeli counterpart, Mossad Chief David Barnea, and top officials from the government of Qatar, which has been mediating indirect U.S. and Israeli talks with Hamas over the release of hostages held in Gaza. There was no public indication of progress in the Doha talks over hostages. Biden has also said he does not think there should be a formal ceasefire until Hamas is defeated. Trump says on Univision he could weaponize FBI, DOJ against his enemies. Washington Post. Former President Donald Trump has said that if he is elected in 2024, he may use the federal government to punish his critics, and defended his administration's separation of migrant families at the U.S.-Mexico border. Trump has also told advisors and friends in recent months that he wants the Justice Department to investigate former Trump officials and allies who have become critical of his time in office. Trump has also talked of prosecuting officials at the FBI and Justice Department, a person familiar with the matter said. China envoy to U.S. says stable ties, still a long way off. Nikkei Asia. China's ambassador to the United States, Xie Feng, stated that Sino-U.S. relations have shown positive signs of stabilizing but still face challenges. He emphasized the importance of finding the right way for the two countries to get along. Xie mentioned that under the leadership of President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden, relations have recently shown positive signs, but still have a long way to go to stabilize and improve. Both sides believe that maintaining dialogue is beneficial and necessary, and hope that Sino-U.S. relations will stabilize and improve as soon as possible. Xi and Biden are expected to meet at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation (APEC) Forum in San Francisco later this month. Biden courts union votes in trip to Midwest car plant. Financial Times. President Joe Biden spoke at a victory rally for a car factory in Illinois and urged workers to remember who had stood with them during their strike. Biden highlighted that, while his predecessor went to a non-union shop, he stood shoulder to shoulder with striking workers. He also expressed support for unionization at Tesla and Toyota, and urged union workers to continue organizing across the car sector. India to seek reassurance on U.S. Indo-Pacific focus amid growing China ties. South China Morning Post. The U.S. is expected to push for stronger military and diplomatic ties with India in high-level talks on Friday. The talks, known as the 2+2 Ministerial Dialogue, will be attended by U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, as well as their Indian counterparts Subrahmanyam Jaishankar and Rajnath Singh. The talks were established in 2018 to strengthen U.S.-India ties. The discussions are seen as an opportunity for India to seek reassurance that the U.S. remains committed to the Indo-Pacific region despite growing engagement with China. India is closely following the growing engagement between the U.S. and China, and the talks will allow India to clarify Washington's approach toward China. The talks are also expected to focus on deeper bilateral defense ties and reducing India's reliance on Russian arms. The U.S. is likely to seek to wean India away from dependence on Russian equipment as India seeks to modernize its military. The talks may also address strengthening cooperation among the members of the Quad Security Pact, which includes India, Australia, Japan, and the U.S. U.S. invests $553 million in Adani's Sri Lanka port to curb China's influence. South China Morning Post. The U.S. will provide $553 million in financing for a port terminal in Sri Lanka's capital being developed by Indian billionaire Gautam Adani, as New Delhi and Washington look to curtail China's influence in South Asia. The U.S. funding may serve as an endorsement for the short seller stung Adani Group, as well as the controversial port project in which it holds a majority stake. The conglomerate has been fighting a raft of corporate fraud allegations leveled by Hindenburg Research and various media investigations, which it has repeatedly denied. Green files motion to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Washington Post. Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene has filed a motion to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. The motion, which calls for impeachment over the Biden administration's handling of the U.S. southern border, is expected to be voted on next week. The move highlights an issue that some Republicans had hoped to put on the back burner, as the party reassesses its use of its impeachment authority. Impeaching a cabinet secretary is rare, and the effort is likely to draw backlash from Republican moderates, who have voiced concerns that the party's willingness to dangle the threat of impeachment process against Democratic figures could affect the party's chances in next year's elections. Former Biden campaign staffers call for Israel-Hamas ceasefire. Al Jazeera. Over 500 former campaign staffers have signed a letter calling on U.S. President Joe Biden to work towards a ceasefire in Gaza, and to address the conditions of occupation, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing that they say are at the root of the violence. Their call follows similar efforts from other groups within the government, including employees at the United States Agency for International Development, who have also called for a ceasefire. Biden has ruled out any definitive stop to the conflict, and has voiced unconditional support for Israel throughout the conflict. Not all electric vehicles can go the distance. Bloomberg. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund, PIF, Lucid Motors' biggest investor, has watched its investment decline in value from over $55 billion to just $5.4 billion since 2 years ago. Lucid is miles away from becoming cash flow positive, and the government of Saudi Arabia, which is Lucid's most loyal customer, has committed to buying 100,000 Lucid vehicles over the next decade. However, Lucid only expects to build about 8,500 cars this year. In contrast, BYD, which is focused on batteries, is predicted to overtake Tesla as the world's biggest EV maker. Berkshire Hathaway bought about 10% of BYD in 2008 for $230 million, and it is now worth more than $9 billion. Former U.S. President Barack Obama is shaping the future of AI regulation and policy. He has helped the White House put together a sweeping executive order on artificial intelligence, which includes a 20,000-word master thesis on how humanity can adopt and safeguard against the technology. Obama spoke with tech leaders, advocacy groups, and policy think tanks to inform his assessment. He has provided materials that ring alarm bells about AI, while also providing content that speaks positively about its potential. China plans to reach quantitative parity with the U.S. in terms of its stockpile of deployed warheads by the mid-2030s. Beijing's efforts to become the third nuclear superpower have raised concerns about the potential for increased nuclear arms competition and the risk of nuclear conflict. If China's efforts are successful, it could lead to a dangerous cycle of arms buildup and threaten global stability. Experts warn that this could drain the economy and potentially lead to the near erasure of human civilization. Alaska judge sides with ConocoPhillips on new $7.5 billion oil project. Bloomberg. A U.S. federal judge has upheld the Biden administration's approval of ConocoPhillips' Willow oil development project in Alaska, rejecting claims from environmentalists that it would harm wildlife and contribute to climate change. The approval allows ConocoPhillips to proceed with the $7.5 billion project, which is expected to produce 180,000 barrels of oil per day. The ruling follows a fierce lobbying effort and opposition campaign against the project, which environmental and indigenous groups argued violated environmental regulations. They also claimed that the project would harm polar bears. The challengers plan to appeal the decision. The political perils of taking James Comer's word for it. Washington Post. House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer, Republican Kentucky, has been spreading false claims about Hunter Biden's business dealings and other Republicans are now repeating them. Comer has made claims about shell companies and influence peddling by Joe Biden, but hasn't proven anything. Comer has been testing his claims like a ninth grader dropping eggs from a roof with parachutes and claiming they will work. The eggs always splat, but Comer has convinced his peers that he is a great parachute maker. Now, Representative Greg Murphy, Republican North Carolina, has been repeating Comer's claims on CNN, and they were quickly debunked. Murphy claimed the Bidens created 20 shell companies, which is false, and claimed there was influence peddling by Joe Biden, which Comer hasn't proved. Murphy also claimed that Joe Biden was selling his influence, but the host pointed out that Hunter Biden was not an elected official, just like Bannon. The host asked why Murphy voted against holding Bannon in contempt, but would vote to hold the Bidens in contempt. Murphy didn't have a good answer, just saying it was different because Trump was president. First-of-a-kind nuclear project is terminated in a blow to Biden's clean energy agenda. Associated Press. The Biden administration's clean energy agenda has suffered another blow, with a project to build a first-of-a-kind small modular nuclear reactor power plant being terminated. Oregon-based NuScale Power had the only small modular nuclear reactor design certified for use in the U.S. For its first project, it was working with a group of Utah utilities to demonstrate a 6-reactor plant at the Idaho National Laboratory, generating enough electricity to power more than 300,000 homes. The project was to come online starting in 2029, and was supposed to replace electricity from coal plants that are closing. However, the project has now been cancelled after a decade of work. The cancellation follows last week's termination of 2 major offshore wind projects in New Jersey. Yellen, Chinese counterpart, begin talks to lay groundwork for Biden-Xi meeting. South China Morning Post. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said on Thursday that she would talk to her Chinese counterpart Vice Premier He Lifeng about the use of economic tools for national security purposes, as they hold 2 days of meetings in San Francisco. Their visit, the second since July, when Yellen visited China, came days before the start of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Leaders Summit, where U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping are expected to meet on Wednesday. Israel-Gaza war driving U.S. to distraction benefits Russia and China. South China Morning Post. The ongoing conflict in Gaza is a distraction for the U.S. and its support for Ukraine, which is welcomed by Russia and China. The conflict has caused divisions within the U.S. political establishment, with some Republicans opposing aid to Ukraine whilst supporting aid to Israel. This has opened up an opportunity for Russia and China to take advantage of the situation. Russia hopes that the U.S. will be drawn into another conflict in the Middle East, distracting attention from Ukraine, whilst China has been proactive in calling for a ceasefire and stationing warships in the region. U.S. Senator Joe Manchin says he won't run for re-election, in blow to Democrats. South China Morning Post. U.S. Senator Joe Manchin has announced that he will not seek re-election, dealing a blow to the Democrats' prospects for maintaining their Senate majority in 2025. Manchin, who is seen as the only realistic chance for Democrats to keep the seat in Republican-leaning West Virginia, hinted at a potential presidential run as a third-party candidate. He is an honorary co-chairman of No Labels, a centrist group that is laying the groundwork for a possible third-party campaign. Manchin has $11.3 million in his Senate re-election account that could be used to fund a presidential campaign. West Virginia Governor Jim Justice and conservative Congressman Alex Mooney are running for the Republican nomination for the Senate seat. Friday briefing: Israel expands pauses in combat. New York Times. Israel has agreed to put in place regular daily 4-hour pauses in its unrelenting assault on Hamas in selected areas of northern Gaza to allow civilians to flee, a White House spokesman said. The agreement is the culmination of days of pressure from President Biden as the casualty toll in Gaza mounts. A senior administration official told Congress that casualties in Gaza might be even higher than are being cited, and the WHO said that disease was surging. The agreement expands on what Israel has been doing in recent days. Its forces have allowed people to evacuate northern Gaza for several hours at a time along a single corridor south. The White House spokesman said that a second corridor would be opened and that the daily pauses would be institutionalized to include advance notice of at least 3 hours. "I've asked for a pause longer than 3 days," Biden said. But he has not joined the calls by some in his party and around the world for a full ceasefire, reasoning that Israel has a legitimate interest in destroying Hamas after its October 7 terrorist attack killed more than 1,400 people. He ruled out the prospect of a ceasefire again yesterday, saying, "None. No possibility. Don't count on Xi-Biden meeting to yield results, provided it happens," analysts. South China Morning Post. The upcoming meeting between U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping is not expected to yield significant breakthroughs, but rather to focus on stabilizing the bilateral relationship and improving communication. Both sides have low expectations for the meeting, and it is unlikely that a joint statement will be issued. Possible outcomes could include agreements to further discuss or cooperate on climate change, fentanyl, and artificial intelligence. Improved communication between the Pentagon and the People's Liberation Army is also a potential area for progress. However, the U.S. is unlikely to achieve its goals of ending reckless Chinese behavior and resuming strategic stability talks, while China hopes to see an end to punitive tariffs and export restrictions imposed by the U.S. Beijing is also seeking reassurances that the U.S. does not support Taiwanese independence. Overall, the Chinese are interested in stabilizing the relationship in the short term, while the Americans hope to gain insight into Xi's thinking and assess China's economic problems. It's time to update your talking points about oil production. Washington Post. Critics of President Biden claim that the U.S. is not producing enough oil due to his policies, but the data shows otherwise. According to the Energy Information Administration, the U.S. is currently producing more oil and exporting more oil than it did during the Trump administration. In fact, the U.S. has produced 11.2 billion barrels of crude oil since January 2021, compared to 10.1 billion barrels produced from January 2017 to August 2019. Additionally, the U.S. has been exporting more crude oil and petroleum products under Biden, debunking the claim that the U.S. is not energy independent. How McConnell helped engineer Manchin's exit. Yahoo! Mitch McConnell and Senate Republicans worked for more than a year to make Joe Manchin's retirement announcement on Thursday a reality. And for good reason. The Democrats' decision puts Republicans on the precipice of a majority that's eluded them for 2 straight election cycles. Judge in Alaska upholds Biden administration's approval of the massive Willow oil drilling project. Associated Press. A federal judge has upheld the Biden administration's approval of the Willow oil drilling project in Alaska's remote North Slope. The decision comes despite objections from environmental groups who argue that the project will contribute to greenhouse gas emissions and harm ice-reliant species already affected by climate change. The project, proposed by ConocoPhillips Alaska, could produce up to 180,000 barrels of oil a day and would result in significant greenhouse gas emissions over its projected 30-year lifespan. The decision may be appealed by the environmental groups. That's all the news for today, folks. Israel has agreed to temporary pauses in its offensive against Hamas, but there is still a gap between Israel and the U.S. Former President Donald Trump has made controversial statements about using the federal government to punish his critics. China's ambassador to the U.S. says that stable relations with the U.S. are still a long way off. President Joe Biden has been courting union votes in the Midwest, while India seeks reassurance on the U.S. Indo-Pacific focus amid growing China ties. The U.S. is investing in Adani's Sri Lanka port to curb China's influence. In U.S. politics, Republican Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene has filed a motion to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Former campaign staffers are calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, and former President Barack Obama is shaping the future of AI regulation and policy. China plans to reach quantitative parity with the U.S. in terms of its stockpile of warheads, raising concerns about increased nuclear arms competition. A U.S. federal judge has upheld the approval of ConocoPhillips' oil development project in Alaska, despite objections from environmentalists. And U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen is holding talks with her Chinese counterpart to lay the groundwork for a meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping. Remember, these are just headlines, and there is always more to the story. So, what are your thoughts on these news stories? Let's discuss. Thank you for tuning in. The content above showcases the latest briefing reports and analytical synopses, thoughtfully curated by the 6Do team. These insights stem from a wide array of reputable media outlets, think tanks, government sources, and specialized experts worldwide. We encourage you to explore these sources for a comprehensive perspective. Keep in mind that while the content may not always align with the official standpoint of 6Do Brief, it's not meant to be taken as absolute directives for decision-making. Comprising seasoned media professionals, learned scholars, and accomplished scientists, the 6Do team embodies a trailblazing, fully independent media entity. To customize 6Do Brief to meet your professional needs, you have the option to subscribe to a diverse array of briefings on our website, 6dobrief.com. Regardless of your location, you can conveniently receive 6Do Brief via email.